This is Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong is taking your questions on how brain science is influencing legal cases. Sinnott-Armstrong is the Chauncey Stillman Professor in Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and the Keenan Institute for Ethics. He co-directs the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project and is a co-investigator at the Oxford Center for Neuroethics. A forthcoming book from Oxford University Press, which he co-edits, is Conscious Will and Responsibility. To ask Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
I'm James Todd from Duke's News Office, and I am here with Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong. Professor Sinnott-Armstrong, I want to dive in with an actual legal case, a Supreme Court case that is Graham versus Florida, and brain science appears in this case. So could you set this up for what's the case, and then how does neuroscience appear in it?
You know, it's a very important case for people who work on neuro law because it was the first time that the Supreme Court actually mentioned neuroscience in a majority court opinion. Terrence Graham committed burglary when he was 17 of a shop, and during that incident, the shop owner was injured quite severely. He was tried for that, convicted of burglary, but the judge in that first trial gave him probation, so he was released. But while he was on probation, he committed further crimes, the worst of which was breaking into a home to steal things with a bunch of friends. And so probation was revoked. He was brought back for sentencing on the original burglary charge, and the judge gave him the maximum, which was life in prison. And in Florida, there was no parole, so that meant life without parole for an 18-year-old kid who had committed a couple of burglaries. So various legal groups jumped to his defense and argued that that was cruel and unusual punishment, and the court agreed for a number of reasons, but one of which was that adolescents of that age are not fully mature. Not only are their personalities still growing and changing, but also their brains are still growing and changing. And so the neuroscience came in at that point to support the psychology, the observational evidence that they don't have the same capacities as fully mature adults, and because of that are not fully culpable. They're still culpable. It's not like anybody was arguing that he shouldn't go to prison at all, but life without parole seems much too much for someone at that stage of their life.
So neuroscience there being used to make a distinction between the juvenile brain and the adult brain. Now, another case that brings up a slightly different issue that you've taken a look at is this prosecution of Brian Dugan in Chicago, convicted for serial murder. How does brain science appear in that case?
Right. That's a very different case, because Brian Dugan was a psychopath who committed horrible crimes, including murders of young women decades before in the Chicago area, DuPage County. And other people had been found guilty of those crimes and had spent a long time in prison, even though Dugan had over the years admitted that he committed those crimes. He didn't hide it. So he was then found guilty of a number of different crimes, and the neuroscience came in there in the sentencing phase of the trial.
Okay.
So as with the Graham case, it was with regard to sentencing. But here is a question of capital punishment. Should he get capital punishment or not? And the defense wanted to introduce brain scans as a mitigating factor to show that he should not get capital punishment but should go to prison instead. That case is actually currently under appeal because of some strange things that went on with the judge during the jury delivering its verdict. But the interesting thing is that neuroscience was introduced. The brain scans were in the evidence book at the sentencing phase. Now this is just the start. It's still not being used in the guilt phase of the trial, but it's it's entering the courts and coming to a court near you soon.
So in the Dugan case, when a defense attorney throws up his brain scan, I mean, what might they be pointing to in particular that says, see, here's a mitigating factor vis-a-vis the death penalty?
Well, there would be two different types of scans that were used there. There would be structural scans, which would show smaller brain volumes and abnormalities in the paralimbic system in the lower part of the brain. But there would also be functional scans showing that while Dugan was processing certain types of information, including, for example, emotional words, that his brain patterns were different from normal people. So that the emotions just didn't have the same effect on him. When you see a word like rape, most people go, oh, that's
right.
a real jarring word. But he didn't show the same kind of reaction in his brain patterns in the functional scans.
In talking about this concept of responsible and fully responsible for these crimes, we've got a question that's been emailed in, and it is, aren't the people who commit crimes still criminals and still responsible for their actions, whether they are conscious of them or not?
Well, I don't know about that. It seems to me that if you, there's a certain element, every criminal decision is made on the basis of the actus reus, the actual act that is performed, the mens rea, the mental state that goes along with it, and then there are further considerations of culpability relevant, for example, to the insanity defense or to youth. But let's look at the actus reus. If I leave a restaurant and pick a coat up off the rack and take it out of the restaurant, and it turns out it's not my coat, I have not committed theft. Merely moving your body in a certain way is not enough to commit a crime. There has to be a mental state that accompanies it, okay? So if the brain scans can help us to understand better the mental states that people were in when they committed these crimes, then they can be helpful for whether they're guilty or not, even of the basic crime.
So let's talk about these mental states, because I think people that watch TV dramas, I mean, they hear words like premeditation or pleading insanity. And so how might brain science be used as an evidence about a mental state?
Well, there could be a lot of different possibilities. With regard to psychopaths, just to go back to Dugan, you could do brain scans. We're doing brain scans to try to figure out whether they process moral judgments in the same way, which would be evidence about whether or not they appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct, which is relevant, at least according to the wording of the insanity defense in most jurisdictions. You can also use brain scans to detect, when I say you can, I mean people are trying to, I'm not sure that it works, but they're trying to use brain scans to detect lies by witnesses, for example, to detect pain when people claim that they deserve disability benefits for the rest of their life because of a workplace injury, and the insurance company thinks that they're faking it, to detect consciousness in end-of-life cases when people are in vegetative states but we're not sure what's really going on there.
Terry Schiavo, I think, is a big case in that.
Is an example of that. And to detect memories. Somebody says, I've never seen this person before. How dare them accuse me of being a conspirator in this case? Well, we can see whether they remember the person's face in a certain way that's distinctive of having encountered them before. But again, when I say we can do that, part of the problem is we can do that with a certain level of reliability, and at this point, we can do it in the lab.
Okay.
So one of the problems is, does any of the stuff from the lab translate to the actual courtroom and the actual crime scene and the actual defendant? The other question is, look, it's going to be reliable, but it's never going to be perfect. So is it reliable enough? And that's where society and the legal system have to make a normative judgment. The scientists can do the best they can to get it as reliable as possible, but in the end, society has to make a decision about whether or not to allow this kind of evidence into the trials.
And so can you talk about the steps that a lawyer would have to make, the argumentative steps to go from, okay, here's a picture of somebody's brain, therefore it's a mitigating factor, or therefore they didn't actually feel the pain. I mean, it seems that it's not immediately obvious, at least to a jury, to look at a picture of a brain and go, oh, I see he was lying.
I could do it with either one of those.
Let's start lie detectors.
Let's start with lie detectors.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do the memory case because it's a type
Okay.
of lie detection
Right.
that's a little bit simpler. What you would do is you would show them 50 pictures of people that they've never seen before, and then they see those pictures. And then you show them, and then you put them in the scanner and you show them those 50 mixed in with another 50. And you figure out which brain patterns are distinctive of the 50 they've seen before versus the 50 they haven't seen before, right? Then you get a pattern classifier that tells you the pattern of brain activity working when they recognize a picture, recognize a face.
And brain
Okay.
activity, is that electrical, a blood flow?
It's electrical activity, but it's measured indirectly by blood flow using functional nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. Then what you do is you take, say 20 of the 50 they've seen before and a new 20 they haven't seen before, but this time throw in the face of the person they claim they've never met. You know, he says I did this crime with him. I've never seen this person before. Well, now we can check it. We can see whether the pattern that arises in the person's brain when they see a picture of that person is similar to or different from the faces he's seen before versus the faces he hasn't seen before. Now notice there's an obvious flaw here. Well, he might have seen this person in the courtroom or in the trial, so you can't always use it. You can only use it when they actually say, I still haven't ever seen this person. Right? So it's not always going to work, and when it works, it's not going to work perfectly. The question is, how can we use the science to make it work as well as possible in as many as possible cases? And then, will it be working well enough?
You're watching Office Hours at Duke University. I'm here with Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong. He is the Chauncey Stillman Professor in Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy in the Kenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke. Professor Sinnott-Armstrong, we were just talking about an example of a kind of lie detection, and I think the lie detector is something that can capture the popular imagination.
Yeah.
Do you see in the future the kind of metal dome coming down over the witness's head and a buzzer going off? And I mean, is that in the short term? Or is that just sci-fi stuff?
I don't see it coming down over the witness's head, certainly not in the courtroom. But I do see the introduction of neuroscientific evidence when the scans were done off-site and then the results are brought in. I think it's very likely that's going to happen. Nita Farahani, a Duke grad in philosophy and in the law school, has documented that over a 5-year period, there were hundreds of cases that introduced neuroscience. And I don't remember the exact number, but I remember in California alone, there were over 60 in this 5-year period, and the number was increasing. So yes, it's coming in. It's coming in somewhat surprising ways, for example, with regard to competence rather than culpability, more than culpability, but also with regard to culpability and mitigation of sentencing. Notice the 2 cases I mentioned were sentencing. It's coming in at that stage rather than the person's not guilty at all. It's more that they're guilty, but they shouldn't be punished as much because of a certain finding. So it is coming, yes.
And so as neuroscience is being introduced, again, peering into the future, right now we're all used to DNA evidence. I mean, it's now not only on TV, but in courtroom cases and in proving innocence. It's common, people accept it. Do you see that kind of same acceptance growing for brain scans, for neuroscientific evidence?
It's possible. That would be pretty far in the future because DNA evidence is extremely reliable at this point. And if people think that neuroscience has to live up to the standards of DNA, then they're going to be very disappointed in the reliability rates that they see when they look at the actual experiments, because neuroscience is nowhere near that degree of reliability at present. There might be some circumstances where it gets very reliable, but not like the figures you hear from DNA. So it'll be like it in some ways, but different.
And so, in talking about Professor Farahani's work, Duke alumna, there's this emerging field of neuro law, and you've been involved in these conversations that talk about this intersection of science and law. So, what's this field about? What are the conversations, the topics that people are writing about?
Well, they're writing about the detection of mental states, like we just mentioned, detection of lies, detection of pain, detection of memories, detection of consciousness. That's one area in which neuroscience is getting used currently. There are companies being started, 4 companies I know of with regard to lie detection, and there's a rumor of a company for pain detection just getting off the ground. So that's one area, is detection of mental states. Another area is the criminal responsibility area that we mentioned with regard to juveniles and Dugan. Defense mainly using brain scans to argue that they should receive less sentence or maybe even no sentence at all. Also general issues in that area where some neuro studies have led some people to claim that nobody's ever responsible for anything. And then you get in the big philosophical issues about free will and downward causation and so on. And that's part of the field as well. But the third area that I think is worth mentioning, that's distinct from responsibility and also from detection of mental states, is prediction. There are some people who think that you can use neuroscience to predict various types of behaviors that are relevant to the law. So when someone is served a 10-year sentence in jail, the question is, should we let them out? Well, in some cases, you can be pretty sure they are going to commit another violent crime.
And how could you be sure? How could you predict the future?
Well, you would predict the future, first of all, not solely on the basis of neuroscience. Neuroscience would not do it alone. But neuroscience can be supporting evidence in a larger package of evidence. For example, there's what's called the psychopathy checklist revised. And people who score over 30 on that have, in many previous studies, 80% recidivism rate for violent felonies within 5 to 7 years, depending on the study. But you can be pretty sure they're going to commit a violent crime. And that, by the way, that's 80% that were caught. The other 20% might have done it too, they just never got caught.
So these are people that fit this definition of being a psychopath.
Right.
And then there's an 80% recidivism.
Exactly.
Given that category.
And neuroscience comes in because one of the features of psychopaths is that they're pathological liars. So you can do these interviews, but some are going to slip through the cracks because they're good enough at fooling the interviewers. And so neuroscience comes in as supporting evidence that'll increase the reliability of the evidence that these people are recidivists that have to be watched or controlled in some way. Maybe just watched more carefully during their, after getting out of prison. Maybe use GPS anklets on them so that you know where they are, or maybe not let them out of prison, because the U.S. Supreme Court has held in Kansas versus Crane and Kansas versus Hendricks that sexual predators can be kept in jail for the rest of their life, in prison for the rest of their lives, if they're likely to commit further offenses and if they lack control over whether they do or not. So that's another possibility on the horizon. It scares a lot of people. And yet it also has some promise for stopping these people from repeating their crimes. So that's always the tricky line you have to walk in this field. You want to be optimistic about the possibilities and get what you can out of neuroscience. But on the other hand, it's very dangerous stuff if it gets abused and misinterpreted.
In talking about the limits of neuroscience, we've got a question that's come in by email, and everyone watching is invited to ask Professor Sinnott-Armstrong a question. You can do that by email, you can do it by Twitter or by Facebook. This question is, isn't bringing in neuroscience going against the legal tradition of trial by jury? So I guess there's that a jury is going to have limits in terms of the information they can take in, and the case is always about a specific person. So yeah, what are some of those limits?
Right. One Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, has said in a previous opinion that lie detection, no matter how reliable, even if it was 100% reliable, still should not be allowed in because it usurps the traditional role of jurors. And some people have that attitude. My view is, there's some good traditions and there's some bad traditions. If there's a tradition that's leading to a lot of mistakes in our criminal courts, so that people are found guilty when they shouldn't be found guilty, then if we have a better way of doing it, then we ought to be careful before we overturn traditions because there's usually some wisdom in the tradition. But once it's been tested, if it works better and leads to fewer mistakes in the criminal justice system, then why not? Is my question. The mere fact that it's tradition is not good enough. What we want is the most reliable, most accurate criminal decisions we can get. And if science helps us make those decisions more accurate, then it's a useful tool.
And in talking about limits, what would be some wrong ways of using neuroscience, particularly when you're dealing with a jury that's, it's a lay group and doesn't have expertise, they're not scientists, and maybe you've seen examples already of how neuroscience has been misused in the courtroom, or you could imagine some.
Well, sure. For example, if someone has frontal lobe damage, then they might say, I should be let off. Or I should receive a lesser sentence because I have frontal lobe damage and therefore I don't control my behavior. And then they say, here's a study for you. Frontal lobe damage produced in Vietnam vets, in a study by Jordan Grafman, led to a 5-fold increase in aggressive violence during, I think it was a 2-year study, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong there. But it was a 5-fold increase in violence. And so this person says, I've got this thing that produces a 5-fold increase in violence, therefore I'm mitigated. Wait a minute, let's look at that study carefully. It matters a lot where the lesion is in the frontal lobes. Frontal lobes are like Asia. They're a big place, a giant area of the brain, first of all. But second of all, even in Jordan Grafman's study, 5-fold increase meant from 3% to 15%. There's still 85% that didn't. So the mere fact that you've got frontal lobe damage is just not good enough to say that your sentence ought to be mitigated. And yet, if you come in with this picture of the person's brain and there's this black area that's absolutely clear and it's a structural scan that's a very reliable form of scanning of the brain, then it might be convincing to jurors. In one study by Gurley and Marcus, when you had testimony about brain injury plus pictures of brain scans, it led from, instead of 11% of the defendants being found guilty, it went all the way up to 42%. So almost 4 times as many people are being found not guilty by reason of insanity in that particular study, simply because they've seen this brain scan. But the brain scan doesn't really show you anything out of the context of all the psychological information, and without knowing exactly where in the frontal lobes it is, it really has to be done very carefully, and when it's done badly, it can lead to bad results.
Yeah, you have the CSI effect. People now have seen CSI, and so they think, well, where's the DNA evidence? And so you're talking about a scenario where a juror, a hypothetical juror, says, I didn't necessarily understand that brain science, but they're bringing that kind of evidence, so therefore they must have a good case, and that's a misuse. That's
absolutely a misuse. People don't trust jurors, and so we wanted to find out whether jurors really are going to get swayed. Neuroscientists, don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are neuroscientists, but they think they're going to walk into the courtroom and they're going to go, I'm a neuroscientist and I've got this degree and I've got all these publications, and you, the jurors, are going to get wowed and believe what I say. Well, it doesn't actually work that way.
Okay.
When we did a study, this is Michael Sachs out at Arizona State Law School, did a study. I just helped design it. He ran it. And did most of the design as well. I don't want to take credit when it's really his work. It was in the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience project that I co-directed. So we found that, in fact, brain images didn't have much effect at all.
So jurors are shrewder than you might think.
They come out of and there are all these anecdotes of jurors coming out of the courtroom. They were trying to pull the wool over my eyes. Those fancy scientists with their credentials. But notice, that's bad too, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding and mistrust. It might be that the jurors trust the scientists too much. It might be that they trust them too little. I'd kind of like them to trust them the right amount. But that, of course, requires a lot of scientific training and careful explanation and public understanding of neuroscience. So part of this field is interested in just getting the word out about neuroscience so that people will understand it better, both its benefits and its dangers.
Very good. You're watching Office Hours at Duke University. I'm speaking here with Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong. He is the co-editor of a forthcoming Oxford University Press book, Conscious Will and Responsibility. We've got some questions coming in. One comes by email from Stuart, and he asks, how might our neuroscience-based understanding of behaviors such as drug addiction lead to changes in sentencing or treatment guidelines? Could we hope that this might lead to fewer incarcerations?
You can always hope, Stuart. That's a good question. Addiction is a big problem in our country. And we mentioned youth and psychopathy, but addiction is right up there with its connection to crime and its importance. Whether the neuroscience is actually going to change the law is anybody's guess. I think it's very likely. I'm hopeful because I think it should change the law. We're incarcerating people who would be much better off if treated in an appropriate treatment program, and a lot of states are beginning to see that with alternative legal systems, alternative courts, drug courts, which enforce treatment plans rather than prison, and that keeps the families together, that helps the drug addict, and it reduces the recidivism rate as well. So I think there's a lot of hope there, and I think the neuroscience of drug addiction, which is much more advanced, for example, than the neuroscience of psychopathy, is helping to drive that, because people see that people's brains have actually been changed by these drugs, and that leads them to think that maybe they don't have as much control as they used to have. That's a very tricky inference, whether the fact that their brains have changed means they don't have as much control, but it does seem to lead people to draw that conclusion, and then they tend to be more supportive of alternatives to prison.
Okay, we'll keep picking up this issue of responsibility and
Yes.
degrees. We've got an email question here from Nazanin, who asks, in regards to performing brain scans on suspects, are there any potential ethical issues concerning breach of privacy? Will there be warrants issued for these scans? So privacy, I mean, it comes up with DNA, with brain scans, I imagine, too.
A very good question, and the person I mentioned before, Nita Farahani, has a wonderful paper on this. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but you can look her up at Vanderbilt and check her website. I'm sure it's up there. The privacy issues are quite interesting because there are several amendments to the Constitution that are relevant. The self-incrimination clause, you can't be required to incriminate yourself. So if the brain scan is seen as a form of speaking, it sounds like you're being forced to incriminate yourself. But if the brain scan is instead just looking for a trace of a memory of the person, as in the case I mentioned before,
Lie detection.
then it's not speaking. You're just looking at the pictures. You're not forced to say anything. So then it looks less like self-incrimination. But maybe it looks like unreasonable search and seizure. Unreasonable search and seizure, you're not taking a blood sample for the person. That might not be allowed, a blood sample without their consent. This is non-invasive. You just have to sit in the tube in the middle of the magnet, so we're not actually taking your blood. So it's a very interesting issue in constitutional law, whether this violates traditional rights to privacy or not, because it kind of falls in between, taking a blood sample and making the person confess. It's not really quite the same as either of those, and it'll be fascinating to see what the court decides on that issue.
And what about an analogy with fingerprinting? I mean, that's non-invasive, and we don't, book them and fingerprint them. I mean, could it be a book them and scan them?
Exactly. If it's more, and actually, one of the first companies on lie detection was very smart. They call themselves brain fingerprinting because they want to say what we're doing is like fingerprinting, and that's why you ought to allow it in the courtroom.
And neuromarketing will be a different topic. Okay. Nazanin actually came back with another question here. Do you think we should scan everyone and declare them adults if they have a certain level of brain development instead of making everyone an adult at 18? I guess this takes us full circle to the Graham case and juvenile versus adult.
Another great question. You got a great audience. The answer is no. And the reason is that the rate of false positives in all of these scans is going to be quite high. They're good, but they're imperfect. And when you start talking about the general population and using it for a screening device, you're going to be making too many mistakes.
And so false positives, explain that. What would be the danger with false positives of some kind of preemptive evidence?
So she was asking about age and immaturity, but let me switch just because it's simpler back to the psychopathy. I can do a brain scan now and look at the structure of your brain and use that as a predictive tool for your psychopathy score. And if you're over 30, that means there's an 80% chance of recidivism in the next 5 years. That's pretty scary. And the reason it's scary is because it's got a pretty high false positive rate and high false negative rate. It's impressive that we can do what we can, but it's still got a pretty high rate. Psychopathy is only about 0.5 to 1% of the population. Well, if you have even a 5% false positive rate, that means you're going to have an awful lot of people being falsely diagnosed as psychopaths just in order to catch a very small number who actually are psychopaths. That's not a good policy for the legal system. So screening, I think, is probably not a good thing to do. There are also, of course, cost issues. I mean, the cost of scanning everybody in this country would, be tremendous. What we're really talking about here more, the only thing that's really practical is taking people after they've committed crimes and then using scans on them.
You're talking about false positives, and before we were comparing neuroscience with the other big science in law of DNA, but you're also bringing up fingerprinting, other sciences or semi-sciences that get used in the courtroom. I mean, blood splattering, and where does neuroscience fit now and maybe in the future on the reliability scale for evidence that's introduced?
Well, it's certainly better than boot prints and handwriting analysis, at least for some of the things that neuroscience is used for. But it's definitely not as good as DNA. So it's somewhere in the middle. And where in the middle depends on which particular use we're talking about. If we're talking about giving a diagnosis of psychopathy, that's one thing. Detecting lies is another thing. Detecting consciousness at the end of life, yet another thing. And so different levels of reliability for different uses. So it's hard to answer the question more specifically, except to say they're all getting better.
Good.
In the future, 5, 10 years down the line, it's going to be much better. You look back, the first brain scans, first fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging scans, were less than 20 years ago. First studies published using fMRI, less than 20 years ago. It's amazing how far this science has come in 20 years. You project 20 years in the future, I wouldn't even try to guess what the reliability figures are going to be and what the uses are going to be.
You mentioned consciousness at the end of life, and I think if we talk about neuroscience and the law, we have to talk about the Terry Schiavo case and related. So what does brain science have to say about persistent vegetative state? That's the term that we hear in the news.
Right. One of the questions is whether it's persistent. Another question is whether it's vegetative. Mm-hmm. There was a recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine, this is I think last May, where Stephen Lorry's group scanned 52 patients who were supposedly in minimally conscious states or vegetative states, and that tried to detect consciousness in those states. And they found one patient, I'll just tell you about one of them because you don't want to hear about all 52. But one of them they found it was just truly amazing. They said, okay, this person is lying there with motionless, no indication of any reaction on the outside to the environment. And they said, imagine that you're standing on a tennis court, and now move your arm as if you're hitting a tennis ball back to a professional during a lesson who's hitting it right to you. So you don't have to move your legs, just move your arm.
Imagine. So they can't do it, but imagine.
They can't do anything. They're
Okay.
lying there motionless on the table. Just imagine it. And they detected activity in the motor strip,
And was it
which
detected?
is the area of the brain that would have been used to actually move their arm to play tennis.
And does this person have electrodes on them? Are they in a?
They're in a fMRI. They're in a
fMRI.
large donut-shaped magnet.
Okay.
Okay. Then they said, now imagine walking through your home. You go from room to room, and they found activity in the spatial location area, which is a very distinct part of the brain. And on a control sample, they got 100% accuracy as to what the person was, these areas were clearly associated with that type of thinking. So they said, we got to check this out. So they said to this person, who again is just lying still, and by the way, this is a 22-year-old who'd been in a vegetative state for 5 years from a traumatic brain injury. They said, was your father named Robert? I forget the actual names, but was your father named Robert? If the answer is yes, think about playing tennis. If the answer is no, think about walking through your home. And they saw the activity in the tennis area. And sure enough, his name was Robert. They said, was your father's name John? And they said, if the answer is yes, think about tennis. If the answer is no, think about walking through your house. And they saw the area in the spatial. And he answered 5 questions in a row correctly, just by manipulating his brain activity by either thinking about tennis or walking through the house. On the 6th question, there was no response, and they think he probably went to sleep. Because the suspicion is, especially after 5 years in a state like that, you're going to come and go with consciousness. So this type of study is obviously fascinating. It has big implications for what we should do with patients who are in this kind of circumstance. But I want to say, don't jump to conclusions. One of the big dangers in neuroscience is people go, oh, that's great, isn't it cool? I mean, it really is cool. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to jump to conclusions or practical actions too quickly. For example, this is not Terri Schiavo. Terri Schiavo, it was a brain disease 19 years before, and almost her entire brain had atrophied and the cells were dead. And there's just no chance that there was consciousness in that case, unlike this case, right? So you really need careful neuroscientists, or in this case, neurologists, to come in and tell you, is this brain activity really indicative of this or not? And one of the problems is that it's very technical stuff. Mm-hmm. Neuroscience is not easy. Mm-hmm. And then you pull people off the street and say, I want you to be a juror, right? And you don't know neuroscience from neurology. You don't know the difference. And you have to sit there for 8 hours listening to arguments in the courtroom. And most people are not used to listening to arguments more than a couple of minutes at a time. Maybe an hour if they listen to the presidential debates. But most people, by the end of the presidential debates, are tired. That's a lot of argument. Well, you have to do that 8 times in a row when you're a juror. Listen to people do it. And then remember it later. So there's a lot of problems with, is the jury really going to understand this kind of information? Or even the judge, by the way. Judges, a lot of judges were English majors or whatever. They don't know science. And yet they're the ones that are going to have to decide as well.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question that's come in along those lines of neuroscience and a lay understanding. Everyone watching can ask Professor Sinnott-Armstrong a question. You can do that by email, you can do it by Twitter, or you can do it by Facebook. This question comes in by email from Christine, who asks, can scans pick up on emotional states like guilt? So I guess that's a twist on the lie detector, but it's someone feeling guilty about what they have done.
Yeah. Good question. Emotional states, yes. Mm-hmm. And again, with limited reliability. Mm-hmm. Guilt is a very complex emotion. Mm-hmm. Anger is much easier. Disgust, much easier. Mm-hmm. There's some basic emotions that neuroscientists have been studying, and they have associated with certain networks in the brain. It's usually not so simple that, anger is in the amygdala and disgust is in the insula. It's not that simple. It's going to be a network. But they can pick up on some basic emotions and see not only whether the person's feeling it, but in some cases, in some studies, some indication that they can detect how much anger they're feeling or how much disgust they're feeling. Guilt, though, guilt's very complex. I wish the caller would even tell me exactly what it is. That would be nice to know.
We've got another question coming in from Tara. And switching gears a little bit about your own career and interest. I mean, you're a philosopher, and here we've been talking about law for a long time. And she asked, how did you start studying this? Were you always interested in brain science?
I think I was always interested in brain science. When I was in college, the psychologists watched rats running through mazes, or they, put lesions into rats and did electrode studies. It was only in the later 90s and the noughties, the first decade of the second millennium of the 21st century, that we were able to do the high-level cognitive type work that we're doing now. What got me interested in this was really a student. I was teaching my introductory ethics course, as I always did, and I said, here's Kant, and here's utilitarianism, and here's the doctrine of double effect, and Aquinas and Aristotle, and you're teaching the classic theories. And this one student who, I always say this, and she's not even embarrassed by it, because she was really obnoxious. She would always raise her hand and say, okay, so I have that intuition too, and so do you, but why do we have that intuition? Like, what's behind our moral reaction to that case? And I realized I didn't have a good answer to that question. And so Jana Scheikborg is her name, still a dear friend. And she pushed me towards answering those questions, and she did a thesis on it at Dartmouth. This is back when I was at Dartmouth, and we ended up publishing parts of the thesis in a neuroscience study of the background of these intuitions that drive people. So it was really a student. Then I also have to give credit to other faculty members. Neuroscientists, you come in with a good idea, and they'll usually listen to you. They're really receptive. They say, that's interesting. Maybe we should do an experiment on that. And at Dartmouth, there were a couple of people, Mike Gazanik and Scott Grafton, who basically took me under their wings and said, here's some funding, we'll help you design it, we'll help you analyze it and write it up and talk to you about it. And they were great, very supportive. With the student stimulating you and the neuroscientist helping you, it's hard not to be fascinated by this stuff.
So yeah, with our remaining time here, you are a philosopher. You're talking about philosophical schools of thought. Some of that must come to bear in terms of how law and neuroscience interact. I mean, you're talking about issues of free will and responsibility and justice. Do you have a philosophical school that you subscribe to, or are there competing schools?
I do have a school that I subscribe to, but I'm not sure that the audience wants me to explain it in great detail. I'm a contrastivist, but only professionals even know what that means, and only about 10 of us actually subscribe to it. So, but the basic role for philosophy in these issues is to try to get the concepts clear, and that's where contrastivism actually helps. Take freedom, for example. Is your country free? Are those mints free? Am I free to act as I wish? And the student who comes to the office and says, Professor Sinnott-Armstrong, are you free right now? You want to understand the concept of freedom. It's not just ambiguous, by the way. It's not just like, pig pen and writing pen. It's not ambiguous. There's actually a contrastivist analysis to show how they're all getting at a central core structure of the concept. Now, what does that have to do with neuroscience? The answer is, if we're really going to use neuroscience to understand freedom and responsibility, we have to get clear about what we're trying to understand. And the neuroscientists are great at getting empirical data. What the philosophers add is conceptual analysis to get really clear about what the question is and what we're trying to find out with this scientific research.
And so how does that, you're co-editing this book from Oxford University Press, Conscious Will and Responsibility, some highlights from there that touch on this?
Well, that was triggered by the fact that Benjamin Libet died in 2007. So we had a little conference.
And who is he?
He was a great neuroscientist who studied simple motor actions like flexing your wrist, just moving your wrist, in some cases just pressing a button. And he got some very surprising results. He actually found that the brain activity of a certain sort, called a readiness potential, or RP, started about a third of a second before you were conscious of choosing to move your wrist. You could choose to move your wrist at any time you wanted. And you could record when you became conscious of choosing to move your wrist. But it looked like the brain activity was happening, that led to your wrist moving, was happening before that, which made it look like consciousness wasn't the cause of your wrist starting to move, he said. And of course, there's a big debate about that. And the volume has, people going, no, you can't say that. Yes, you can say that. And follow-up experiments of various sorts using, everything from, hypnosis to bells and TMS, deadening certain brain cells at the time. So it's an interesting volume because it starts with these very simple experiments of just what's happening when you move your wrist, and draws big philosophical implications and legal implications as well. Although many of the people in the volume are very skeptical about those potential implications. There are others in the volume who say, actually, you can draw some big lessons from little experiments.
Okay. That's pretty deep territory there.
Yeah.
We got another question. I want to get this in before
Okay.
we sign off here. An email from Mark. Could Dr. Armstrong address the ethical problem of what should be done pragmatically with people who may have conscious activity but are unlikely to come out of such comatose conditions? Also, the procedures for detecting such conscious states require highly specialized training that is expensive and not covered by insurance. So, back to the, persistent vegetative state, comatose condition.
I think that not covered by insurance is probably not going to be much of a problem, because if the insurance company is paying for the hospitalization of this person, then they surely want to find out whether this person wants to remain on life support or not. It's very possible. I mean, I'm just projecting my own situation. If I were in this kind of situation, I'm not sure whether I would want to, continue treatment or not. If we think patients have the right to decide whether or not to be treated, and to treat them without permission is a violation of their rights of privacy, then a patient in that situation could be asked, do you want to be kept alive or not? And you might have to ask it several times to make sure that you've got the answer straight. You want to make sure that you're not just misreading the
You're talking
data.
about detecting it through brain activity.
You say, if you want to stay alive, think of playing tennis. If you don't want to stay alive, think of walking through your house. And if you do that 5 times and get a consistent signal and a consistent answer over a period of time, then they're in effect telling you, withdraw treatment. I do not give you permission to treat me. And then to treat them might be a violation of their rights. So it could have big implications, but you got to be careful because, as the caller said, it takes training. This stuff is imperfect at this point, but I can imagine a day when, not too far off in that case actually, when we could take those patients and ask them what they would like. Which it seems to me is what medicine ought to be doing. Not telling people what ought to happen to them, but asking them what they want.
Good. Professor Sinnott-Armstrong, we've covered a lot of territory here. And let's wrap up. You've got a conference coming up in the spring.
Yes.
So we'll give a shout out. What, if people might be interested, what should they look forward to?
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting. I'm organizing it with Scott Hutel in the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience here, and the Duke Institute for Brain Science is funding the large portion of it, and the Keenan Institute for Ethics as well. It's about the implications of neuroscience and psychology, but mainly neuroscience, for free will and responsibility. So we'll have people coming from all over the country to I think there are 5 philosophers and 7 neuroscientists. There's some people who do animal work. There are people who do EEG work or electroencephalograph work, as well as fMRI studies. So we have a variety of different methodologies, variety of different subject populations. There's some people talking about addiction for the caller who asked about addiction. And the big question is, can neuroscience help us address these traditional philosophical puzzles that people have been wondering about for so long, and that that really do have practical importance in terms of the legal system.
Professor Sinnott-Armstrong, thank you for holding your office hours online today.
Thanks.
Professor Walter Sinnott-Armstrong is the Chauncey Stillman Professor in Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and Keenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke. He also co-directs the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project. He is co-editor of the forthcoming Oxford University Press book, Conscious Will and Responsibility. I'm James Todd from Duke's News Office. You've been watching Office Hours at Duke University. A recording of this conversation and many other Duke videos will be available on the Duke On Demand website.
Watch Duke.
On Demand.
ondemand.duke.edu.
This week on Duke On Demand, a Duke Athletics video report takes a look back at the victories and lessons from last year's championship season.
Men's basketball, obviously, phenomenal run. Men's lacrosse, phenomenal outcome. When I think of those epic championship games, I'll take them to the grave. But we were so close to having a phenomenal year across, again, 26 sports, campus, rec, intramurals, and the physical education program. And we didn't really have a phenomenal year. We had a really good year, but we have a lot ahead of us because we have a chance to have a phenomenal year.
Also this week, Enhancing My Medical Education Through Photography is a talk at the Center for Documentary Studies by Duke pediatrician and photographer John Moses.
And Defense Secretary Robert Gates gives an address on campus about the makeup of the military.
ondemand.duke.edu.